Have you ever said something and felt the weight of it hit you a second too late? That sharp realization that your words cannot be taken back, that they now live in the minds of others, shaping how you are seen, judged, and remembered. Every man who has lived long enough knows that moment, and Stoicism begins exactly there, not with grand ideas, but with restraint. The Stoics understood something most people never fully grasp. Speech is not a casual act. It is a declaration of character. Every word you release either strengthens your inner authority or slowly erodes it. An intelligent person is not defined by how much they know, but by how carefully they allow that knowledge to pass through their mouth. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that nothing reveals the soul faster than unguarded speech, because words are thoughts made public. When you speak without discipline, you give your impulses permission to represent you. When you speak with intention, you let reason stand at the door before anything exits. This is why Stoicism places such importance on speech, not as a tool to impress others, but as a mirror of self-mastery. Most people speak to fill space, to seek approval, to assert status, or to protect their ego. They talk quickly because silence makes them uncomfortable. They explain too much because they fear being misunderstood. They promise too easily because they want to be liked, and in doing so, they weaken their presence. The intelligent person does the opposite. He slows down. He considers whether his words are necessary, truthful, and aligned with his values. He understands that silence is not emptiness, but control. Epictetus taught that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, not as a cliché, but as instruction. Listening is not passive. It is an act of strength. It allows you to observe before you expose yourself. It allows you to learn before you declare. In a world where everyone is competing to be heard, the man who speaks less but with precision immediately stands apart. His words carry weight because they are rare. His opinions matter because they are not scattered carelessly. This is not about being quiet for the sake of mystery. It is about refusing to waste words on ego-driven expression. Stoicism is ruthless about this, complaining without purpose, boasting about knowledge, dismissing others, making promises you cannot keep, denying your mistakes, oversharing plans that are not yet formed. These are not small habits. They are leaks in your inner structure. Each one reveals insecurity disguised as confidence. Each one signals that the ego is speaking instead of reason. The Stoic does not aim to sound wise. He aims to be aligned. He knows that credibility is built slowly and destroyed quickly, often by a single careless sentence. This is why Stoicism teaches restraint before reaction. You do not speak because you feel something. You speak because what needs to be said serves truth, clarity, or action. Everything else is noise. When you master this discipline, something subtle but powerful happens. People begin to listen differently, not because you are louder, but because you are deliberate. They sense that when you speak, it matters. Your words are no longer filler, they are signals. And just as important, you stop betraying yourself with speech that does not reflect who you want to be. The Stoics believed that inner freedom begins with control over what is within your power, and speech is always within your power. You cannot control how others react to your words, but you can control whether those words deserve respect. This is where intelligence truly begins, not in knowing more, but in saying less, better. In the next parts, we will break down the specific phrases and habits an intelligent person avoids, not out of fear, but out of discipline, because every sentence you refuse to say strengthens the man you are becoming. One of the fastest ways a man quietly loses respect is not through ignorance, but through the need to advertise intelligence. Stoicism treats this impulse with deep suspicion, because it almost always comes from insecurity rather than strength. An intelligent person understands a simple truth. Knowledge that needs to announce itself is already weakened. The moment you feel compelled to tell others how much you know, what you have achieved, or how experienced you are, you have shifted from substance to performance. And performance is fragile. It depends on validation. It needs an audience. It collapses the moment someone is unimpressed. Marcus Aurelius warned against this long before social media existed, reminding himself that nature does not boast about what it produces, and neither should a man. A tree does not explain that it is strong. It stands. A river does not declare that it is deep. It flows. In the same way, intelligence reveals itself naturally through judgment, restraint, and the quality of one's actions, not through constant explanation. Most people boast because they fear being overlooked. They fear that if they do not speak up, they will disappear. The Stoic sees this fear clearly and refuses to let it rule him. He understands that real authority is not taken, it is granted, and it is granted quietly over time. Think of the difference between a man who constantly reminds others of his credentials and a man who listens, asks precise questions, and speaks only when clarity is needed. The first demands recognition, the second earns it. Stoicism always favors the second path. There is another reason intelligent people avoid boasting. It closes the door to learning. The moment you present yourself as someone who already knows, you make it socially and psychologically harder to receive new information. People stop correcting you. They stop offering insights. They nod, smile, and withhold their best thoughts. Epictetus warned that no man learns anything while convinced he already understands. Boasting is not just annoying, it is self-sabotage. It signals that your identity is tied to being right, not to discovering truth. The Stoic does not protect an image of intelligence. He protects his ability to grow. This is why intelligent people often downplay what they know, not because they lack confidence, but because their confidence is internal. They do not need the room to agree with them. They do not need applause. They measure themselves by alignment with reason, not by admiration. When they speak, it is not to impress, but to clarify. When they share knowledge, it is to be useful, not superior. This distinction changes everything. A man who boasts creates distance. A man who contributes creates connection. People do not feel challenged by him. They feel supported. They do not feel measured against him. They feel elevated. This is why Stoic wisdom spreads quietly. It does not announce itself. It shows up in calm responses, in thoughtful pauses, in decisions that are firm but not loud. Another subtle danger of boasting is that it ties your self-worth to comparison. If you need to tell people how smart you are, you also need them to stay less smart than you. This creates anxiety. You begin to scan conversations for threats. You feel irritated when someone else shines. You feel defensive when corrected. Stoicism seeks freedom from exactly this trap. True freedom is not needing to win every intellectual exchange. It is being able to say, "I don't know," without feeling diminished. It is being able to learn from anyone, regardless of status. Intelligent people avoid boasting because they understand that humility is not weakness, it is leverage. It keeps the mind open. It keeps relationships healthy. It keeps the ego from hijacking reason. Over time, this discipline compounds. People begin to trust your words because they know you do not speak to inflate yourself. When you do share insight, it lands harder because it is rare. Your silence gives context to your speech. Your restraint gives credibility to your knowledge. This is the Stoic path. Let others discover your intelligence instead of forcing them to acknowledge it. Let your actions, decisions, and consistency speak where words would cheapen the message. In the next part, we will examine another phrase intelligent people avoid, one that seems harmless but quietly destroys respect the moment it is spoken. Few sentences erode respect faster than the quiet reflex of saying, "That's not my fault." On the surface, it sounds reasonable. Sometimes, things truly aren't. Circumstances intervene, other people make mistakes, systems fail. But the Stoic understands something deeper. The moment a man rushes to defend himself, he gives away the very power he is trying to protect. Intelligence, in the Stoic sense, is not about assigning blame correctly. It is about taking responsibility, where responsibility gives you leverage over your life. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea constantly. He reminded himself that external events are rarely under our control, but our response always is. When you say, "That's not my fault," you may be factually correct, yet you have placed the solution outside yourself. You have announced that the problem belongs elsewhere, and with it, any power to change the outcome. Intelligent people avoid this phrase because they understand a hard truth. Responsibility is not about guilt. It is about agency. A man who says, "That's not my fault," is often trying to protect his ego. A man who asks, "What can I do next?" is protecting his future. There is a subtle but critical difference. The first looks backward, searching for innocence. The second looks forward, searching for control. Stoicism always chooses the second. Consider how leaders earn respect, not by being flawless, but by being accountable. When something fails, the respected leader does not scan the room for someone else to blame. He absorbs responsibility, even when the failure was shared, not because he enjoys guilt, but because he understands that ownership creates authority. People trust the person who does not hide behind excuses. They follow the one who says, calmly, "I'll handle it." This is not weakness. It is strength under discipline. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when we stop trying to control what is not ours and fully assume control of what is. Blame is a distraction. It keeps the mind busy, defending an image instead of solving a problem. Intelligent people see through this trap. They know that even when a situation is unfair, complaining about fairness changes nothing. What matters is response. What matters is adjustment. What matters is learning. Saying, "That's not my fault," might relieve emotional pressure in the moment, but it trains the mind to externalize control. Over time, this creates a quiet sense of helplessness. Life keeps happening to you. Other people keep causing your problems. The Stoic refuses this narrative. He asks a harder question: what part of this is mine to improve? Even if that part is small, it is enough. Because improvement compounds, there is also a relational cost to deflection. When you deny responsibility too quickly, others feel it. They hear not logic, but avoidance. Trust weakens, collaboration suffers. Intelligent people understand that relationships are strengthened not by perfection, but by reliability. Reliability grows when people know you will not disappear behind explanations when things go wrong. You will stay present. You will stay engaged. You will adapt. This does not mean accepting blame for everything. Stoicism is not self-flagellation. It is clarity. If something truly lies outside your control, release it. But if there is any action you can take, any lesson you can extract, any adjustment you can make, that is where your focus belongs. The Stoic mind is trained to ignore the noise of blame and attend to the signal of responsibility. Over time, this discipline changes how others see you. You become someone who does not panic when things break, someone who does not argue about who is right, but quietly fixes what is wrong. Someone whose presence stabilizes situations instead of inflaming them. That is real intelligence. Not the ability to explain why something failed, but the ability to move forward without excuses. In the next part, we will examine another phrase that appears confident on the surface, but often hides fear and erodes respect from within. There is a sentence many men are proud of, one they wear like armor: "I don't need any help." It sounds strong, independent, self-reliant. In a culture that celebrates the lone figure who carries everything alone, this phrase is often mistaken for confidence. But the Stoics saw through this illusion. They understood that refusing help is rarely a sign of strength. More often, it is a quiet form of pride. And pride, when left unchecked, becomes a weakness disguised as virtue. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in history, never pretended he stood alone. In his private reflections, he listed what he learned from others with humility and gratitude. teachers, mentors, family members, even critics. He did not see dependence as shameful. He saw cooperation as natural. To the Stoic, a human being is not meant to be an island. We are parts of a whole, strengthened by connection, not diminished by it. When someone says, "I don't need any help," what they often mean is, "I don't want to appear weak." But intelligence is not concerned with appearances. It is concerned with effectiveness, and effectiveness increases when effort is shared, perspective is expanded, and blind spots are revealed. Epictetus taught that we should use everything available to us in accordance with reason. That includes other people's knowledge, experience, and support. Rejecting help is not noble if it slows growth, increases error, or isolates the mind. There is another hidden cost to this phrase: exhaustion. The man who insists on doing everything alone eventually collapses under the weight he refuses to share. He becomes irritable, rigid, and closed off. Others sense this tension. Respect quietly fades, replaced by distance, not because people dislike him, but because they cannot reach him. He has built walls where bridges were needed. Intelligent people understand that asking for help does not reduce authority. It increases it. When you ask for help wisely, you demonstrate self-awareness. You show that you know your limits and respect the strengths of others. This builds trust. People are far more willing to support and follow someone who acknowledges reality than someone who pretends to be invulnerable. Consider leadership. The leaders who inspire loyalty are not those who claim to have all the answers. They are the ones who ask good questions, who invite input, who say, calmly, "I don't see the full picture yet." This does not weaken their position. It strengthens it, because it replaces ego with clarity. Stoicism is not about carrying more than you can bear. It is about bearing what is yours and releasing what is not. Help, when accepted with discipline, is not dependency. It is strategy. There is also a deeper Stoic lesson here. Refusing help often comes from fear of loss of control. But control is not lost by collaboration. It is lost by isolation. When you shut others out, you shrink your world to the limits of your own perception. When you allow others in, you expand it. You gain angles you could never see alone. The Stoic seeks truth, not validation. And truth is rarely found in isolation. Saying, "I don't need any help," may protect the ego in the short term, but it starves the soul in the long term. It prevents learning. It delays growth. It turns manageable challenges into unnecessary struggles. Intelligent people choose differently. They ask for help early, deliberately, and without drama. Not from everyone, not impulsively, but from the right people at the right time. They understand that strength is not proven by silence, but by discernment. Knowing when to stand alone and when to stand with others is wisdom. The man who never asks for help eventually becomes invisible in his struggle. The man who asks thoughtfully becomes respected for his honesty and clarity. In Stoic terms, this is alignment with nature. Humans are social beings. Cooperation is not weakness, it is design. When you release the need to appear invincible, you gain something far more valuable: resilience. In the next part, we will explore another phrase that quietly shuts down growth and convinces men that life is already behind them, even when it is not. There is a phrase that sounds harmless, even realistic, but quietly shuts the door on life. "I'm too old for that." It often appears disguised as wisdom, as if the speaker is being practical, grounded, mature. But beneath it lies resignation, a belief that growth has an expiration date, that curiosity belongs to the young, that change is something you miss, not something you choose. Stoic philosophy rejects this completely. To the Stoic, age is not a limitation of the soul. It is merely a condition of the body. And even the body, while finite, is capable of far more adaptation than we give it credit for. Marcus Aurelius was writing Meditations in the later part of his life, while carrying the weight of an empire, illness, and war. He did not speak as a man winding down. He spoke as a man sharpening himself. Stoicism teaches that as long as you are alive, your responsibility is the same: to live in accordance with reason, to improve your character, and to meet each moment with discipline and clarity. Saying, "I'm too old for that," is not an observation. It is a decision to stop trying, a decision to freeze identity at a comfortable point and defend it from discomfort. Intelligent people understand that this phrase does not describe reality, it creates it. Once you say it, your mind stops exploring alternatives. You no longer ask, "How could this work?" You only explain why it cannot. And what the mind rehearses, it eventually believes. There is also fear hiding inside this sentence. Fear of looking foolish, fear of starting over, fear of discovering that you are not immediately good at something new. Youth tolerates failure because it expects it. Adulthood often avoids failure because it confuses competence with worth. The Stoic does not make this mistake. He understands that dignity does not come from avoiding embarrassment. It comes from refusing stagnation. Epictetus taught that progress is not measured by external achievement, but by the refinement of judgment. Learning something new, changing direction, or stepping into unfamiliar territory refines judgment at any age. In fact, it often does so more deeply later in life because experience provides context. There is a quiet arrogance in saying, "I'm too old for that." It assumes that growth is linear and that the most meaningful changes must happen early. History proves the opposite. Many of the most profound shifts in thinking, purpose, and contribution occur later, when urgency replaces vanity and depth replaces speed. Intelligent people recognize that time remaining is not an argument for withdrawal. It is an argument for focus. Another cost of this phrase is the example it sets. When you declare yourself too old, you give silent permission to others to do the same. You normalize decline instead of development. Stoicism calls us to lead by character, not by complaint, to demonstrate through action that growth is a lifelong discipline, not a phase. This does not mean chasing novelty for its own sake. Stoicism is not about reckless reinvention. It is about continuous alignment. If something is worthwhile, if it strengthens your mind, body, or character, age is irrelevant. The only real question is intention. Are you moving toward virtue or retreating into comfort? Intelligent people ask a better question than, "Am I too old?" They ask, "Is this worth my remaining time?" That question restores agency. It shifts focus from limitation to value, from fear to choice. There is also peace in this approach. When you stop measuring yourself against arbitrary timelines, you stop grieving versions of life that never existed. You begin working with reality instead of arguing with it. You invest energy where it matters most. The Stoic understands that death is inevitable, but decay of the spirit is optional. Saying, "I'm too old for that," is often the first step towards spiritual retirement. Intelligent people refuse it. They remain students. They remain adaptable. They remain engaged, not because they are chasing youth, but because they respect life too much to abandon it early. In the next part, we will examine a phrase that delays action, weakens resolve, and quietly steals years from people who believe they will get to it later. There are few phrases more dangerous than "I'll do it later." It sounds harmless, responsible, even. A promise to yourself that you'll return when the timing is better, when you're more prepared, when life slows down. But the Stoics understood something most people avoid confronting. Later is not a place. It is an illusion. And for many, it becomes the graveyard of intention, where good ideas, honest conversations, and meaningful changes quietly die. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily of impermanence, not to provoke fear, but to sharpen focus. He wrote, as a man fully aware that time is not owed to us. Saying, "I'll do it later," assumes control over something we do not possess. Intelligent people recognize this arrogance and refuse it. They understand that delay is often fear in disguise. Fear of discomfort, fear of failure, Fear of discovering that the thing we are postponing actually matters more than we want to admit. Stoicism teaches us to examine impressions carefully. When the thought later appears, the Stoic asks, "What am I avoiding right now?" Rarely is the answer, "Nothing." More often, it is a difficult conversation, a disciplined habit, or a decisive step that would force clarity. Postponement protects the ego in the short term, but it taxes the soul over time. There is also a psychological cost to repeated delay. Each time you tell yourself you'll act later and don't, you weaken trust with yourself. Your word to others may remain intact, but your word to yourself erodes. Over time, this creates a subtle inner tension. You begin to feel fragmented. You know what should be done, yet you keep pushing it forward. This gap between intention and action is where anxiety lives. Intelligent people close this gap deliberately. They understand that action, even imperfect action, restores alignment. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about them. "I'll do it later" is a judgment that now is insufficient, that this moment is not yet worthy of effort. Stoicism rejects this thinking. The present moment is the only arena where virtue can be practiced. You cannot act in the past, and the future does not exist yet. All discipline lives now. There is also a moral dimension to delay. When you postpone something that affects others, a conversation, an apology, a commitment, you are not simply managing your schedule. You are choosing comfort over responsibility. Intelligent people feel this weight. They know that timeliness is a form of respect. Acting when something needs to be addressed signals integrity. Waiting signals avoidance. Consider how often later becomes never. The call you meant to make, the boundary you meant to set, the habit you meant to start. Life does not pause while you prepare yourself emotionally. It moves forward, indifferent to readiness. Stoicism trains the mind to act from principle, not mood. If something is right, it is right now. If something is necessary, delay is disobedience to reason. This does not mean acting impulsively. Stoicism is not haste, it is decisiveness. Intelligent people distinguish between patience and procrastination. Patience is waiting for the right conditions, when waiting serves reason. Procrastination is waiting to avoid discomfort. The difference is clarity of intent. When you say, "I'll do it later," ask yourself honestly which one it is. There is freedom in immediacy. When you act promptly on what matters, you reduce mental clutter. You stop carrying unfinished business in your head. Energy returns. Focus sharpens. The Stoics believed that peace of mind comes not from fewer responsibilities, but from living in alignment with what must be done. Each avoided action is a weight. Each completed action is a release. Intelligent people choose release. They do not wait for motivation. They rely on discipline. They understand that motivation follows action, not the other way around. By acting when something is clear, they train themselves to trust their judgment. Over time, this builds confidence grounded in behavior, not hope. In the final part, we will examine a phrase that seems honest, but quietly shuts down growth and convinces people that change is no longer possible.